New York City, the Copacabana, March 15th, 1960, 11:45 p.m. The most exclusive nightclub in Manhattan is thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of expensive perfume. Dean Martin has just
finished his legendary late-night set, charming New York's elite with his smooth voice and effortless cool. The audience, Broadway producers, Hollywood stars, wealthy socialites, applaud politely as Dean takes his final bow. But as Dean steps off the stage, he spots something that makes his smile falter. Standing near the bar, looking completely out of place among the tuxedos and evening gowns, is Elvis Presley. The 25-year-old king of rock and roll is wearing a simple black suit and trying to blend into the shadows. But his distinctive pompadour and nervous energy make him impossible to ignore. Dean Martin has been waiting for this moment. For months, he's been hearing about this kid from Memphis, who's supposedly revolutionizing popular music. Tonight, Dean has planned something special. A trap designed to expose Elvis Presley as nothing more than a teenage heartthrob who doesn't belong in the sophisticated world of adult entertainment. This is creative storytelling inspired by the documented tensions between traditional crooners and the rock and roll generation, and the cultural clash between old-school sophistication and youthful rebellion. Dean approaches the microphone one more time, his famous smirk spreading across his face. The audience, thinking the show is over, turns their attention back to him with curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean says in his distinctive laid-back drawl, "we have a very special guest with us tonight. A young man who some people think is the future of American music." Elvis freezes at the bar, realizing he's been spotted. The sophisticated crowd turns to look at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. "Elvis Presley is in the house," Dean continues, his voice dripping with mock enthusiasm. "The king of rock and roll himself has graced us with his presence at the Copa." A murmur runs through the crowd. Rock and roll is still considered music for teenagers, not suitable for Manhattan's most exclusive nightclub. Elvis feels every eye in the room judging him, enjoying our little soiree. How about you enjoying our little soiree? How about you come up and show these fine people what all the fuss is about? Let's see if that Memphis sound can work in New York City. It's a perfectly constructed trap. Dean knows that Elvis's style, the hip movements, the raw energy, the sexual magnetism, will seem crude and inappropriate in this refined setting. The Copa crowd expects sophistication, subtlety, class. Elvis represents everything they consider beneath them. Elvis understands immediately what Dean is trying to do. This isn't an invitation, it's a challenge. Dean Martin is betting that Elvis will either refuse, making him look cowardly, or accept and humiliate himself in front of New York's cultural elite. Frank Costello, the notorious mob boss who owns the Copacabana, watches from his private booth with interest. He's heard of Elvis Presley, of course, but he's never seen him perform. To Costello, Elvis represents a threat to the established order of entertainment, the clean, controlled world where men like Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra reign supreme. Jules Podell, the Copa's legendary manager, signals to the house band to be ready. He's nervous about this impromptu performance. The Copa has a reputation to maintain, and allowing some rock and roll kid to potentially embarrass himself on their stage could damage their carefully cultivated image. Elvis stands at the bar for a long moment, considering his options. He could decline politely and slip out of the club, avoiding the confrontation entirely. He could make an excuse about not being prepared or not having his own band. Instead, he does something that surprises everyone. He smiles. "I'd be honored, Mr. Martin," Elvis says, his southern drawl carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet nightclub. "But I hope you don't mind if I do this my way." Dean's smirk widens. This is going exactly as he planned. "By all means, son. Show us what the king of rock and roll can do." Elvis walks to the stage, feeling the weight of every stare. The Copa's clientele is unlike any audience he's ever faced. These aren't screaming teenagers or working-class adults looking for an escape from their daily struggles. These are Manhattan's cultural gatekeepers, people who can make or break careers with a whispered word or a raised eyebrow. The house band, seasoned jazz musicians who've backed everyone from Nat King Cole to Ella Fitzgerald, look at Elvis with barely concealed skepticism. They've heard about rock and roll, but they consider it a passing fad. Music for children who don't understand real artistry.
"What would you like to do?" asks the band leader, a distinguished black man in his 50s who's played with some of the greatest musicians in history. Elvis studies the band for a moment, then makes a decision that will change everything about this evening. "Do you gentlemen know My Funny Valentine?" he asks. A collective intake of breath comes from both the band and the audience. My Funny Valentine is a jazz standard, a sophisticated ballad that requires subtlety, control, and emotional depth. It's the antithesis of everything people expect from Elvis Presley. Dean Martin's confident expression falters slightly. This isn't what he anticipated. He expected Elvis to demand his own material, to insist on rock and roll arrangements that would sound jarring and inappropriate in this setting. The band leader nods slowly, intrigued despite himself. "We know it." "Good," Elvis says, approaching the microphone. "But we're going to do it a little different than you might expect." Elvis begins to sing, but not in the style anyone anticipates. Instead of his famous rock and roll delivery, he performs My Funny Valentine as a pure ballad, his voice smooth and controlled, with just a hint of his distinctive southern warmth. The sophisticated Copa audience, prepared to cringe or laugh, instead finds themselves leaning forward in their seats. This isn't the wild, gyrating performer they've heard about. This is a vocalist with genuine technique, real emotional depth, and an understanding of how to interpret a song. Dean Martin, watching from the side of the stage, realizes his trap is backfiring spectacularly. Instead of exposing Elvis as an amateur, he's given him a platform to demonstrate talents that most people don't know he possesses. But Elvis isn't finished. As the song progresses, he begins to add his own subtle touches, a slight rasp in his voice during emotional moments, small rhythmic variations that show his understanding of both jazz and country music traditions. The band, initially skeptical, begins to respond to Elvis's musical intelligence. The pianist adds more complex harmonies. The bass player provides a stronger foundation. The drummer introduces subtle brushwork that elevates the entire performance. By the time Elvis reaches the bridge of the song, the atmosphere in the Copa has completely changed. The audience is no longer watching a potential train wreck. They're witnessing a masterful performance by an artist who understands exactly what he's doing. Frank Costello, from his private booth, nods with approval. He recognizes real talent when he sees it, regardless of the package it comes in. Jules Padel relaxes for the first time all evening. Not only is Elvis not embarrassing himself, he's giving the Copa crowd exactly what they want: sophisticated entertainment delivered with genuine artistry. When Elvis finishes My Funny Valentine, the silence in the room lasts for several seconds. Then, slowly, the applause begins. Not the polite, restrained clapping typical of Copa audiences, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. Dean Martin realizes he's lost control of the situation entirely. What was supposed to be Elvis's humiliation has become his triumph. But Elvis isn't finished with his response to Dean's trap. "Mr. Martin," Elvis says, still at the microphone, "that was beautiful. But now, I'd like to try something that might be more familiar to folks." Elvis turns to the band. "Gentlemen, do you know That's All Right?" This is Elvis's breakthrough song, the record that launched his career at Sun Records in 1954. But Elvis isn't planning to perform it as the high-energy rockabilly number it normally is. Instead, he arranges it on the spot as a jazz number, with the band providing a sophisticated backdrop for what becomes a completely reimagined version of his most famous song. The Copa audience, many of whom have never heard rock and roll performed with jazz sensibilities, is mesmerized. Elvis is showing them that the wall between different musical styles is largely artificial, that good music is simply good music, regardless of its origins. Dean Martin watches in growing amazement as Elvis transforms his own hit into something that fits perfectly into the Copa's sophisticated atmosphere, while losing none of its original power or meaning. The performance becomes a conversation between Elvis and the band, with each musician contributing ideas that Elvis incorporates seamlessly into his vocal performance. It's improvisation at its highest level, the kind of musical intelligence that can't be faked or manufactured. As the song builds to its climax, Elvis allows some of his natural energy and charisma to show through. Not the wild gyrations he's known for, but controlled, purposeful movement that serves the music rather than overwhelming it. When the song ends, the applause is thunderous. Several people in the audience stand, giving Elvis a genuine ovation. Frank Costello approaches the stage personally, something he rarely does for any performer. "Son," Costello says, shaking Elvis's hand, "you ever want to work the Copa regular like? You just let me know." It's an unprecedented offer. The Copa doesn't book rock and roll acts, but Elvis has just proven that he's more than a rock and roll act. He's a complete entertainer who can adapt to any audience or setting. Dean Martin, realizing his trap has not only failed but made Elvis look like the more versatile and talented performer, approaches with as much grace as he can muster. "Well," Dean says, extending his hand to Elvis, "I guess I learned something tonight." "What's that, Mr. Martin?" Elvis asks. "Never try to embarrass someone who's got more talent than you expected." The audience laughs appreciatively, but there's an edge to it. Everyone understands what just happened. Dean Martin set a trap for Elvis Presley, and instead of catching his prey, he revealed his own limitations. As the evening winds down, various members of the audience approach Elvis with business cards, invitations, and offers. Broadway producers want to know if he's interested in legitimate theater. Jazz musicians want to collaborate. Socialites want to invite him to their private parties. Elvis has not only survived Dean Martin's trap, he's used it to establish himself as a legitimate artist in the most challenging venue imaginable. Later, in the Copa's private dining room, Frank Costello shares a drink with both Elvis and Dean. "You know what I learned tonight?" Costello asks. Both men look at him expectantly. "I learned that the difference between a good entertainer and a great one isn't what they can do when everything goes their way. It's what they can do when someone's trying to make them fail." Elvis nods, understanding the deeper lesson. "Mr. Costello, I appreciate that. But I hope Mr. Martin understands. I didn't come here looking for a fight. I just came to hear good music." Dean Martin, his ego bruised but his professionalism intact, raises his glass. "To Elvis Presley," he says, "who taught an old crooner that you can't judge a book by its cover." They drink, and an unlikely friendship begins to form between two men who represent different eras of American entertainment. The story of Elvis's triumph at the Copacabana spreads quickly through Manhattan's entertainment circles. Within days, offers pour in from venues that had never considered booking rock and roll acts. Elvis has proven that his appeal transcends generational and class boundaries. But more importantly, he's demonstrated something that will define his entire career: the ability to take any challenge, any attempt to limit or diminish him, and transform it into an opportunity to showcase new aspects of his artistry. Dean Martin's trap didn't just fail. It revealed Elvis Presley as one of the most adaptable and intelligent performers of his generation. The kid from Memphis had conquered the Copa, and in doing so, had conquered New York itself. This story is creative storytelling, inspired by the real tensions between traditional entertainers and the rock and roll generation during the late 1950s and early 1960s. While this specific encounter is fictional, it represents the kinds of cultural challenges Elvis faced as he tried to establish himself as a legitimate artist rather than just a teenage phenomenon. The Copacabana was indeed one of New York's most exclusive nightclubs, frequented by celebrities, politicians, and organized crime figures. Performing there successfully would have been a significant validation for any entertainer. Dean Martin, as part of the Rat Pack, did represent the sophisticated, adult-oriented entertainment that dominated places like the Copa. The tension between his generation of performers and Elvis's was very real, though it often manifested as professional rivalry rather than open hostility. The real message of this imagined encounter is about the power of preparation, adaptability, and confidence in the face of attempts to undermine your success. Elvis's ability to succeed in any environment, with any audience, was one of his greatest strengths as a performer. Whether this specific confrontation happened or not, Elvis did prove throughout his career that he could transcend the limitations others tried to place on him, constantly surprising both critics and fans with new demonstrations of his versatility and talent. If this story inspired you to think about how to turn challenges into opportunities, how to exceed people's expectations, and how to maintain your dignity under pressure, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because next week, we're exploring another moment when Elvis faced down the establishment and emerged victorious.